Hi everybody, this is Buddha Vangsa.
And Dhamma.
Are you sure?
Not today.
Anyway, we are continuing our podcast on existential ambiguity, following Wetti Muni's book, Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence. And we're towards the end of chapter 3. And if you take a few minutes and get that ebook, you can follow along with what we're reading. Let me just briefly summarize where we've been so far. This chapter talks about attention. And basically, there are 3 kinds of attention. There is the immediate experience, which is the sensory perceptions of our experience. Then there's reflection, with a C, reflection, which is thinking about memories. And then there's reflexion, with an X, which is when we think about or cognize our present experience. And of course, we're interested in cultivating reflexion, with an X, because we want to attain enlightenment. So what we're doing here is building a foundation of terminology, deeply defining these terms that allow us to classify our experience and our attention in the beginning, and then gradually understand the entire superstructure of consciousness and perception, so that we can approach this state of enlightenment.
You'll give us handles on our experience.
Yeah, most people just experience things and they have no way to influence or parse their experience. To parse something means to go through it and analyze its significance.
They think they are their experience, so they can't step back and modify their experience.
Right, that's reflection or reflexion.
Reflexion is stepping back and observing your experience.
Yes, we want to observe our experience to identify it precisely. In immediate experience, our sense perceptions are the object of our attention. In reflexion, our immediate experience is the object of our attention. In other words, we're experiencing our experience.
You're aware of your awareness.
Yes, like that. It's another level of attention. So this kind of attention is required, well, what to speak of meditation, simply to understand things as they are. And we're going through this book because this is a very important step in the propagation of Buddha's teaching in its original form, unchanged, as it is. What Wetti Muni has done is translated the Buddha's teaching systematically into the terminology of existential philosophy. So anyone who's familiar with existentialism, Heidegger, Sartre, any of those authors, can understand this very, very accurately and put it into practice in their lives. And that's what this is all about. You want to say something?
Not really.
Okay. So I'm going to go on here. We're on the bottom of page 8, chapter 3 of Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence. There is another kind of knowing, quote unquote, that is not derived from seeing or experience. It is conceptual quasi-knowledge derived from reflection, with a C. For example, I can know, quote unquote, the Four Noble Truths by reading about them. This type of knowing is separated from seeing and understanding. and therefore also separated from direct experience. Such indirect knowing or knowledge is unreliable, and it cannot alter the individual. So, what is he talking about here? Reflection with a C. Reflection means we think over, we chew over our past experience and cogitate on it and speculate about it and make plans and do all kinds of things that are unconnected with present immediate experience. And why is this a waste of time?
It's mostly a waste of time, but it's not a complete waste of time. Don't you use reflection when you for example, if you study Paticca-samuppada, if you read it and you think about it and you model it in your mind and you play around with it, it has some value there, but then you have to implement it.
There's some value maybe in the clarification of the terminology.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Yeah.
Because as he says here, this indirect knowing, it's indirect knowing. It's knowing through symbols.
Yeah.
It's not knowing through direct experience.
No.
Therefore, it's unreliable. What if we get something wrong? We can't check back and make sure. We can't verify it.
I've read 1 million Buddhist books, and it was all reflection because it was like duplicating symbols. It wasn't by hearing and through experience. So it was really difficult for me to put the teaching from the book into my experience.
This is what happens with most people. Most people will read books. Even if they read the suttas, it's going to happen. But imagine you're reading some derivative book, some popular book on Buddhism, where the author is compromising to sell books. He's not telling the real truth about Buddha's teaching.
He half understands some very high philosophy, Abhidhamma. He gets it wrong half the time.
Yeah, it's really kind of pathetic. But
and then you're supposed to get some knowledge, some value from it.
Well, the value that people get is simply phrases that they can, trot out at the appropriate moments and impress others.
Yeah, they can feel like they know something about it.
Yeah, they might feel, and others might feel that they know something. But their knowledge is just symbols. It's just words. Yeah. It's not experience. It's not real. So he says such indirect knowing it's not only unreliable, it cannot alter the individual. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to change ourselves.
Yeah.
We're trying to grow. We're trying to attain higher states of being, higher states of consciousness.
Dismantle the ego, not add to it.
Right. Add a few more letters, PhD, LLD, D-Lit. That's indirect knowing. It's unreliable knowledge because it's based on reflection with a C.
It's not phenomenological.
No, it's not phenomenological because it's not based on experience. It's symbolic knowledge, that's all. And like you say, it has some value, but only in reference to itself.
Yeah.
In other words, symbolic knowledge is only valid in the world of symbols. It's not valid in the world of experience. I love my favorite guru, Yogi Berra. He says, theory and practice are the same in theory. In practice, they're different. So, we're talking about in practice. Buddhist knowledge is practical knowledge. It's meant to be realized.
All practical.
Meant to be lived. It's not just something to be thrown around in a debate or used as a status symbol in hip society or something like that. But so many of the hip expressions like dig it, man, Dig comes from Pali. Digha. It means long. Somebody who's in something for a long time is digging it. You see, that's his hipster talk.
That's cool.
Yeah, well, cool also comes from nibbana.
Yes.
Nibbana means cool. Nibbana or nirvana. It means cool.
Quenching of the ego.
Yes. Quench that ego. So much hipster talk and concepts come from Buddhism because they came through the beatniks in the 1950s. You know, I was in that scene. I was a jazz beatnik. You know. But they didn't get the concepts accurately, especially nibbana or shunyata, emptiness, being free from ego.
Yeah.
And it became something to use to build up the ego instead. Thus Buddhism has been like turned around, turned on its head, upside down in the West. And it's just become another mechanism for enhancing the ego.
They were stuck on the mental plane, intellectual speculations like that.
Yes.
Reflection with the C.
In the next sentence he says, this is the type of knowledge, quote unquote, that the person who treats the Buddha's teaching as a scholastic subject dabbles in. Huh? He's dabbling. He's a poser. Huh? He's not really in it. He's only around the edges of it.
It seems like that's most of the people.
It is.
Buddhists.
Especially in the West. We see it again and again. Even people who are teaching Buddhism are like that. Despite all his knowledge, quote unquote, he may not even be warmed by the teaching, let alone transformed by it. And then there's a note here, see the Algadupama Sutta. And the Algadupama Sutta is about a man, a monk, Arita, formerly of the vulture killers. Sounds like a great guy. And he got everything wrong. He got a completely wrong point of view.
Wrong view.
Completely wrong view on the Buddha's teaching. And the Buddha was chastising him. And he says, he got it really so wrong, so badly wrong, that it was like completely backwards. Just like some so-called Buddhists we know think that you can indulge in sensuality and that's still part of Buddhism and stuff like that, ignoring the precepts. But the Buddha just, fried him. He just torched him, man. And he says, and after chastising this guy, he turned to the other monks and he said, what do you think, monks? Is this monk Arita, formerly of the vulture killers, even warm? Is he even warm in this doctrine and discipline? Huh? And of course the monk said, how could he be? No, Lord. Because he got it wrong. Even on the level of reflection, even on the level of symbolic knowledge, he got it totally wrong.
People do all the time.
Yeah, it's very common.
Like Buddha Ghosh.
Well, let's not get into Buddha Ghosh. We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah.
We have to build up quite a bit of knowledge, real knowledge, about the Buddha's teaching first. And then we can talk about these big... That's why I skipped chapter 1 and 2. He brings up all those issues, and I just didn't want to get into it.
No.
After there's a sufficient structure of knowledge, then we can tackle those. Why did the Buddha's teaching get distorted? How has it become superficial?
It's easy to get wrong if you only reflect on it.
Well, anything's easy to get wrong like that because words can be construed to mean anything you want. You can prove that up is down and black is white by logic, by Aristotelian logic. And it's very easy. So, a person who gets it wrong, or a person who, even if they get it right, but it's just verbal knowledge.
They don't practice.
No, then they're not even warmed by the teaching. You see? But our aim is to be transformed by the teaching. And we have to get not more than warm, we have to get melted.
Yeah. And then cool.
Then cool down, quenched. So, further, to see the Buddha's teaching in the way we mean here means more than seeing that experience is as the Buddha points out. I mean, it's important to see that experience, that the way we experience life is as it is pointed out by the Buddha. We have to admit, he drags out all the cobwebs from the shadows out into the sunlight and says, here, look at, this is the way we experience life.
Just take a look.
Yeah, check it out. But To really see the Buddha's teaching means even more than that. It is also to see that the structure of this experience must be, as the Buddha points out, and not otherwise. It is not only seeing the fact, but also seeing the necessity for the fact, why it is the way it is. That's why we need these detailed discussions. If it was enough to just read the suttas and say, okay, that's the way it is, fine. Even if we accept that, we still have to analyze the teaching and see why is it the way it is. And come to understand and be able to think through it for ourselves. This is like that because of this, and because of that, then we have to do this other thing, and that explains something else, and so on and so forth. Until we can see the whole system, as he calls it, the structure of experience. The Buddha is laying out a certain structure. Some people try to read all kinds of things into the Buddha's teaching, but I don't think this is one of them. I think he really does have a certain structure in mind, the structure of human experience.
Yeah, he needs that to eliminate suffering.
Why?
Because you need to understand how the mechanism works to be able to dismantle it.
And this is a point that many people miss. If you're going to work on your car, you have to understand how the car works. It's good if you have a manual that says, okay, take this thing off and then unscrew that and then disconnect the so-and-so, like that. But what if something goes wrong? You have to understand how the car works to really troubleshoot, diagnose, and repair it. So similarly, we have a problem in perception. We have a problem in the structure of our experience that is causing us to miss our natural way of being, our natural enlightenment. So we have to repair that. And to repair it, we have to understand, first of all, how it's working.
Yeah. Actually, we have a disease, so we have to be able to diagnose it.
Yeah, we're like doctors. Yeah, the Buddha is like a doctor. He even describes himself like a doctor. So he's giving the prescription. First of all, he's explaining to the patient, this is your disease. This is how it works. And now I'm going to give you this medicine. And this is how the medicine works. Those are the Four Noble Truths. Your suffering, the cause of suffering, the release from suffering, and how to obtain the release from suffering. Those are the Four Noble Truths. So we have to see the necessity for the structure of our perception. For when we see that fact, this is the way it is, then we also see what has to be done. In other words, nobody can fix us. Nobody can repair us. Nobody can bless us and make it all okay,
The Buddha didn't enlighten anyone.
No, the Buddha didn't enlighten anybody. They enlightened themselves, having understood what has to be done. What is the work? What is the path? And when we see what has to be done, we are altered or transformed by that seeing. Because once we see, we can't unsee.
No. We have to practice seeing like that until the realization.
Well, that's the practice. That is the practice. Some people think that the practice of Buddhism is like sitting in a cross-legged position and watching your breathing and stuff. No. Those are just part of the conditions that make the practice a little easier.
Watching the breathing is to get concentration, to be able to reflect on your inner workings.
Yeah, you need concentration to see on that level.
Do insight.
And most of us are very, very depleted in concentration. Our minds are all over the universe.
Yeah.
The mind is dragging us around, jumping like a monkey.
If we try to do insight before we have concentration, we'll be stuck in reflection.
Right.
We'll observe one or two things in our experience, and then we'll start thinking about it.
Yeah, well, like that friend of ours that we know who spent 20 years sitting in meditation thinking about his childhood. And he hasn't resolved anything.
No.
He's made plenty of very nice rationalizations. But he hasn't really changed his being, hasn't really transformed himself.
Seems like he didn't even have enough faith to put it into practice.
No, it wasn't a matter of faith. Anybody who does something for 20 years has got plenty of faith. He didn't have the knowledge.
Yeah, he didn't duplicate nicely.
He didn't see what had to be done. And he did something else.
Yeah.
Sat there and thought about his childhood and rationalized and did so many other mental things, reflection. He was reflecting on his childhood.
Yeah.
It wasn't...
Continuing the story of I.
Right. So we have to see what has to be done. And at that point, we are altered. At that point, we're transformed. The rest is going to happen as a natural consequence to that seeing. Once we see how it is,
that your story isn't...
And what has to be done. We'll get into what we see later on. You want to jump ahead. Well, the beginning student always wants to jump ahead to the hard stuff, you know. Huh? He's learning the scale of C and he wants to play Bach. So, first of all, we have to see what is. And then from that, what has to be done. And when we see what has to be done, at that moment we're transformed. And the rest happens as a natural consequence. But the point is, once we see that, we're not like we were. We have changed. And that is the transformation. People throw this word transformation around. It's a nice 50-cent word. But what does it actually mean? In their context, it's meaningless. But in the Buddha's context, it means we see the structure of our experience clearly. And once we see that, it becomes obvious what has to be done. So that's what we're working on. We're building the foundation, the conceptual foundation, the terminology to be able to describe and see for ourselves what this experience is.
Well, first we need the definitions of the terms and recognize them in our experience.
Yes. And remember, recognition comes after experience. Recognition is a part of reflection. When we pull back from our immediate experience and see what it means, we recognize what it is. So, the Buddha teaches, I'm going to go on reading here because I want to try to finish this.
Yeah.
The Buddha teaches that there can be only two different fundamental, though implicit, reflexive experience resulting from the same immediate experience. In other words, there are only two modes, pariyaya, of the implicit reflexive experience. One that determines dukkha and the other not determining dukkha, suffering. Thus, the root structure, mula pariyaya, of reflexive experience is of two kinds. Now, so far we've talked about immediate experience, reflection, and reflexion, with an X. So now he's saying even of the reflexion, there is two kinds. One that determines, in other words, causes suffering. And it's not exactly a cause. It's that conditionality. When this type of thinking, when this type of reflexion is present, you get dukkha.
Dukkha is also there.
Yes, they arise together.
Yeah,
right.
Co-arise.
And when you get have this other kind, this other mode, this other pariyaya of reflexive experience, dukkha is not determined.
So there's a taste of the nibbana right there.
Well, we're getting there. Just slow down, young whippersnapper.
If there's no dukkha.
Okay, so the mula pariyaya, the root structure of reflexive experience, is of these two kinds. And then he goes on to make one more major point before he ends the chapter, that there are three types of individuals that the two reflexive experience pertain to. And the first type of individual, who we're going to be talking about quite extensively, is called the putujana, or in the Sri Lankan accent, the putujana. A Putujana is a common or ordinary person. Buddha calls him the uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person. He has not understood or seen the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha's teaching, at all. Thus, he has not been able to reach the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. So he remains a Putujana, whatever his other attainments may be. Buddha describes him as not seeing things as they really are. Yata bhutassa adasana. He therefore remains subject to dukkha. Like that friend of ours who was so-called meditating for 20 years. He didn't really see the Four Noble Truths properly. He didn't have right view. So he wasted his time and he remained a Putujana. Now this is a PhD. This is a doctor. He's an MD, PhD, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, published author, famous guy, appears on TV. But he hasn't really seen the Buddha's teaching. Therefore, he hasn't got the result. He's not on the path to eliminating dukkha. He's just on the path to an elegant rationalization of his neurosis. Poor guy. I feel sorry for him. But he won't study the suttas, so what can I do? So there are many, many people who pretend to be Buddhists who are actually uninstructed, Putujana.
If you don't have right view, you're not on the path.
That's right. You can't be, because right view is the first element of the Eight Noble Path.
Even though you're sitting and thinking...
and going to the temple and doing all kinds of rituals and chanting the suttas and all this stuff.
You can even have jhanas and have wrong view.
It's possible, yeah.
Because it's just concentration.
Yeah, all you have to do is sit enough and you'll get bliss, you'll see lights go on in your head, all kinds of groovy stuff.
But if you don't have right view, you're like led down the garden path.
Yeah, sorry.
By your own self.
Okay, so the second type of individual is a sheka, literally a learning ender, more usually called arhat. He has fully seen and understood the Four Noble Truths and has arrived at the cessation of dukkha. There is no dukkha whatsoever in him. Okay? And the third type of individual taught by the Buddha is called the seka, the learner, also called noble disciple, Arya Savaka. He is neither a Putujana nor an Arhat. He has seen and understood the Four Noble Truths to some extent, depending on his level of advancement. His root structural reflexive experience is still along the same line as the Putujana, although generally weaker in determining dukkha. However, at the level of reflexion, that is, at the level of reflexive experience developed to the order of mindfulness and awareness, his understanding of the Four Noble Truths, although not as complete as the Arhats, equips him to develop himself to the point where his root structural reflexive experience is altered to that of the Arhats, where no dukkha is determined at all. The seka is therefore on the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. This is really important. In other words, it's possible to experience pain, but interpret it in such a way that there is no suffering. Even though in your immediate experience there is suffering, by adopting the understanding of the Arhat, you can parse your experience in a different way. You can interpret your experience in a different way.
I've experienced that.
Yeah.
I remember in Thailand I had this awful headache, and I was identifying with it and suffering, and then I did Anapanasati, and then I was able to not identify with the pain. And it just became like easy to have a headache. It wasn't suffering anymore.
Yeah.
It was just a sensation there.
Yeah.
It wasn't really pain anymore. It was just like a sensation.
Yeah, pain is in our interpretation. Suffering is our interpretation. Okay? We suffer because we have a certain root structure of our experience. This term root structure comes from the Buddha. We're not making this up. He talks about the root structure of our experience as either determining suffering or not determining suffering. Determine, of course, means to make it so, to fix it, to be the cause of something, or to be the condition by which something else exists. So, by the way that we structure our experience, we can either suffer or not suffer. Pain is inevitable. In this world, the body is always subject to different kinds of misfortune. But suffering is our interpretation of our bodily experience. I don't know if anyone has had the experience I have, though, where you can even have tremendous material enjoyment, fame, wealth, followers, be a published author, be well regarded in your field, and be suffering. Success is one of the most difficult experiences of all, because you get everything you ever wanted and you're still suffering. And we'll get into why that is in our further analysis of the experience. So we're almost out of time. There's only one more paragraph, and it contains a really important point. He says, clearly, if the Buddha's teaching is unavailable or has been distorted, there can exist only the first type of individual, the Puthujjana. Now that's the situation in the West.
Yes.
Almost all, at least as far as my experience, all the Buddhist teachings available in the West, the Buddhist organizations in the West, are a distorted copy of the Buddha's teaching. It's particularly true of the Mahayana groups in the West. I mean, there are big, well-funded, popular, famous organizations teaching Buddhism in the West, teaching something that to me is completely unrecognizable as Buddhism. It sounds more like sort of pop psychotherapy and New Age mysticism mixed together, and
feel good about your suffering.
Yeah, packaged into a very easy to swallow kind of nonsense. I don't know what to say about it, except I avoid it.
It's not the teaching of the Buddha.
It's not. It's not the original teaching. It's some distortion of the original teaching. So when you talk to the people who are into that type of Buddhism, you can immediately recognize, if you know the root structure of the Puthujjana, you can immediately recognize it in them.
You can see that they are suffering.
You can see not only are they suffering, but they have elegant rationalizations for their suffering. They've made suffering into Buddhism. It's really weird.
Beautiful story about their suffering.
Beautiful suffering is a type of masochism. It's a type enjoying your suffering. It's really weird. Anyway, the root structures of the reflexive experience of these three types of individuals discussed above, the Puthujjana, the Sekha, and the Asekha.
Arhat.
The Arhat. Right. It says the root structures of the reflexive experience of these three types of individuals are profoundly different. We will refer to these three types of individuals frequently in our discussion below. The above definitions will be adequate for the present. And of course, the first thing that we're going to do is discuss the root structure of the experience of the Puthujjana, because most people are Puthujjanas, uninstructed, run-of-the-mill, ordinary people. Even if they think they know Buddhism, actually the person who is completely ignorant of Buddhism has the advantage that he doesn't have to unlearn so much nonsense. So if you are in the position where you're just starting out in Buddhism, well, you're very fortunate to have run into this particular line, because this line is both an accurate presentation of the original teaching, and it's been translated into a very high level English concepts borrowed from the existentialists. So if you have a background in existentialism, that would be helpful, but it's not required, because we're going to define everything and explain everything as we go along. So that's the third chapter of Weti Muni's book, Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence. I hope you download the ebook, and we're going to go into the fourth chapter in our next podcast episode.
What about long-standing students of Buddhism? Can they still benefit from this course?
Well, of course they can, but they're going to have to be willing to give up their previous understanding and start all over again from the beginning to define their terms properly. That's the only way that the original teaching, the structure of the experience described by the Buddha, can be communicated accurately. And this is the problem with most students who have invested time and energy in a false teaching, that they have to unlearn so many things. And it's a big investment for them. They may also have social connections in that sphere.
Even academic degrees.
Yeah, it's quite possible. So they might have a huge obstacle in the way of unlearning their misunderstanding, their reflection with a C.
The biggest problem is if they have some ego invested in their current understanding.
Exactly. If there, there's a concept in addiction called enablement. In other words, if I'm, let's say I'm married to an alcoholic, and I don't do anything about them going out and getting drunk or buying booze, or let's say I allow them to keep booze in the house or something like that, then I'm called an enabler. I'm enabling their addiction by not actively opposing it. You see, there are many enablers of the misunderstanding of the Buddha's teaching. You mentioned some of them, and I mentioned like these big organizations that are externally very popular, very well funded. I mean, the government especially does not want the original teaching of the Buddha to be widely known, because they would become completely redundant. There would be no need for big power-possessing rascals threatening everyone with violence to keep them in line. It's simply unnecessary. If everybody adopted the teaching of the Buddha, there would be no more crime. There would be no more untruthfulness. The need for regulation of business and so forth would just go away. There would, the government would shrink down to maybe, I don't know, just some administrative, maybe they're maintaining the highways or something like that. There really wouldn't be any necessity for a big, powerful government.
The crazy overconsumption of resources and...
Right, all that would go away. People would begin to act with actual common sense. They wouldn't cease to recognize these huge abstractions of corporate entities like governments, corporations, and things like that, religions, all that would just go away.
Yeah. Why chase that? That only leads to suffering anyway.
Of course it does. So anybody who has their head straight on about Buddhism is not going to participate in any of that nonsense. And they're going to start, like local subsistence agriculture and local economies and stuff like that. So government people really don't want this teaching to get out, and they liberally fund distorted versions. And I know this to be true because I was in a religious organization previously that did get a lot of government funding. And the people at the high levels in the organization were perfectly well aware of it. So these things are going on. We have no government funding. We have no funding whatsoever. Oh, okay. Well, here they come. They're black helicopters are landing. The dogs are barking. Anyway, so we better log off here. This has already gone over time, but I hope you listen to this carefully, think about it deeply, and leave us some comments. Ask some questions. Look alive out there. Let's get some responses to this discussion, because it's very important for anyone who wants to get the real teaching of the Buddha. Thanks for being with us.
Mm-hmm.